Faith and Fellowship Book Festival. We're excited that you're here. We're still admitting a few people, but while we're doing that, I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping things. Please stay on mute. You are entered on mute until we ask you not to, but we're starting out with a speaker, so that's important. Put your questions in the chat and we will monitor the chat, and Jamie will have some time at the end to answer some questions. So be sure you do that. Also check the chat because we're going to put some information there for you. Be sure and stick around after Jamie's talk. We have two panels, Stories from the Past at 7:05 and Who Done It panel at 7:50. Door prizes will be announced at the end of the evening. And we are giving away a copy of Jamie's featured book tonight, The Lost Boys of Barlow Theater. Other door prizes will include books and t-shirts. But for Jamie's book, those in the US will be eligible for a paperback copy, and those outside the US will be eligible for a Kindle copy so long as it's available in your country. The other prizes, though, are US only. If you need to see our complete schedule, check our website. It is www.ffbookfestival.com. And in addition to the schedule on our website, you'll find there the authors that are featured for this year's festival and our bookstore. So you can easily find the books and how to purchase them there. I also want to remind you, if people don't realize, that our book festival is nonprofit. We aren't profiting from these book sales. You will support the authors by buying their books, following them on social media, or signing up for their newsletter. All our sessions are recorded, and you can find them in a few weeks on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, which somebody will put in the chat, please, in a little bit. It's also on our website. You can find the YouTube channel there. And also on the YouTube channel are past festivals and some more content, mostly from the authors. So make sure that you check that out. Okay, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, Jaime Jo Wright. She is a multi-award winning author, including the Christie and Daphne du Maurier Awards. She's a coffee-fueled and cat fancier extraordinaire. She is. If you follow her on social media, you know that. She has entwined her life with the legendary Captain Hook, residing serenely in Wisconsin's rural woodlands. Her literary vocation includes penning chilling Gothic tales, a baffling change from that of Austinites, with a strong preference to the master of dark, Edgar Allan Poe. Two mischievous urchins adorn their family, who keep their mother on her toes, providing an exhilarating amount of chaos. You can visit her website. We'll be putting that in the chat, but it's JamieWrightBooks.com. And she also has a podcast called Madlet Musings, which you can find on your favorite podcast player, or the website madlitmusings.com. So without any further explanation here, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, so much for allowing me to join and even kick off the festival. This is so cool. And it's exciting to see all of you here, and just a blessing to be here. So I love the concept of the title of the festival, Faith and Fellowship. I just think that's so neat. And I'm so huge on community and being a part of the bookish family and the bookish world, as we all love it, whether we're readers or whether we're writers. It's just a neat place to come together because of words and because of story. So as I was thinking about what I was going to talk about tonight, I was kind of given carte blanche to speak on whatever, knowing that there's readers and writers here. I wanted to share about the ministry of story. As it relates to us as readers and as it relates to us as writers. It really doesn't matter which way you come at it. That story throughout time has been used as a way to minister to people. And I wanted to share a little bit of my personal testimony and how I became a writer, and what story has meant in my life and why I do what I do. And also answer the question that hangs over me wherever I go. If you're a Christian writer, why are you writing dark gothic horror thrillers, ghosts, etc.? So we'll answer that large question pretty quickly. It's a pretty quick answer. I like to tell people I'm Edgar Allan Poe meets Scooby-Doo, because I think we all like to have a lot of spook and creepy in our lives, but at the same time, we want to end with a spark of hope. And Scooby-Doo is always known for the janitor of the school hiding under the sheet, and all of a sudden the ghost is no longer a ghost. It's the school janitor. So I love to write these twisty stories with that gothic element of Nathaniel Hawthorne or Edgar Allan Poe, where you're creepy and you're going through the old houses and you think there's a haunting, and then maybe there's an actual explanation for everything. So that's what I love to do when I write. But let's go back a little bit as we talk about the ministry of story, and let's go back in time, back to when I was a little girl and I was sitting on my dad's knee and he was telling me stories, and I was sitting there entranced. And I was really little when he started telling me stories. And then my brother started going to school. And you know how kids come home when they're just learning how to read and such, they have to also do some aloud reading, like they have to read out loud from their books to practice their reading skills, etc. So as a little 4-year-old, I would scuttle up next to my older brother, who at the time was, I think, I would have made him 7, and he was struggling through reading his books, and he'd be reading them out loud, and my mom said I would just be so engaged in the story, like my brother was the master storyteller, even though he was 7. And one night my parents had some friends over, and I was sitting in the corner as usual with a book, pretending to read as I always did. And my mom's friend looked at her and said, "Is Jamie actually reading?" And my mom was like, "Oh, no. She just pretends." "No, I think she's actually reading." So at 4, my mom realized that I had skipped the entire kindergarten era and jumped into first grade reading, and apparently had somehow picked it up from watching my brother. So the first book that I ever read, and it was so exciting, it was riveting, it was suspenseful, it was Dick and Jane. I mean, and I'm not going to lie, I still remember the emotion of sitting in bed with my dad's old hardback bound book and these old colored pages from 1950 something, and these pictures of Dick and Jane. And I remember the feeling of the words telling a story and how exciting it was. And I'll never forget that. And there was nothing more disappointing than when I was older and pulled out Dick and Jane thinking, oh, this is the first book I'd ever read. I'm just going to read it again for fun. See Jane. See Jane run. See Dick. See Dick run. Apparently it's not very exciting, but for a 4-year-old, it's riveting, right? So a story can capture the minds of everyone at whatever age. And what it does, and what it did for me, was it started to transport me places that I couldn't normally go. And I got to meet characters I couldn't normally meet. When I was about 9 years old, I decided I was going to write a story. And I wrote a story about an old oak tree that I named, was very original. I named him Whitey the White Oak, because we had a white oak in our front yard. And underneath Whitey the White Oak lived a family of mice. And I don't know what the mice's purpose, the mice's, that's not a word, the mouses, the mices, what's the plural for mouse? Mice. I don't know what they were under the tree for. I don't know why they lived there. I just wrote about this family of mice that lived under Whitey the White Oak, and they talked to their tree. And there was really no plot. There was really no story. It was just the lives of mice that lived under a tree. And my dad pulled me aside. He said, "What are you writing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm writing this riveting, best-selling New York Times novel." No, I didn't say that. But I said, "I'm writing this riveting novel, and I'm writing this story about these mice in this tree." And he goes, "Well, what's it about?" And I'm like, Mice in a tree. Well, what do? Mice in a tree. And my dad goes, well, they have to have a story, don't they? And I'm like, they do. They live under the tree. And I remember that feeling as I was writing of kind of coming down from this euphoric high of being a writer and crafting a masterpiece at 8 years old to having my first reader just go, oh, there's nothing's happening. Like, you got to add something. And I know my dad meant it to, try and craft the encouragement to, be creative, and let's teach her how to write stories and plot and outline at 8 years old. But as an 8-year-old, I was just like, oh, I'm horrible at this. And that was my first moment with writer's discouragement, right? Where you're like, I'm masquerading as something I am not, and I am not a writer, and I never shall be ever more a writer. And I shut the door on Whitey the White Oak and the Mice. And my dad was like, don't stop writing. We need to, you can learn how to outline. And all of a sudden I just felt restricted, and outlines and grammar and language. And it was so restrictive, and there was nothing fun anymore about writing. And I just quit. So I went back to books because they were already written. So why wouldn't you just do that, right? So I went back to books, and then I started graduating into Nancy Drew and Trixie Belden and a lot of the stories that we all probably grew to love, Boxcar Children, a lot of those classic kids novels, and loved them so much that I decided I want to try my hand one more time at writing a story. So at 13, I wrote my first novel. I was also right about then introduced to Jeanette Oke, because a little lovely elderly woman in our church also volunteered at the local bookstore. And she had decided that the local Christian bookstore needed to have Christian fiction, which was just a new thing, right? And Jeanette Oke was the first and the pioneer. And so she brought over Jeanette Oke's book, Love Comes Softly. And I read it. And I read it again. And I read it again. And I pretty much lost count of how many times I read Love Comes Softly. And it wasn't that the book in and of itself was any sort of literary masterpiece, but it told a story, but it also did something else, right? There was a ministry behind the story that Jeanette Oke was telling. And my heart connected with it because it matched how I was being raised. It matched the blessing of having a relationship with God. It also brought that message of faith into a story organically, in a way where, as a younger reader, I wasn't sitting in church listening to a sermon. I was reading a story that was entertaining, and then I was closing the book wanting to have a stronger faith, wanting to learn more, wanting to understand. I wanted to be like Marty and Clark in Love Comes Softly. So I transferred that emotion into writing my own first novel, which I finished in 2 years. It took me 2 years to write this novel, and I wrote it, and I tried to be as much like I could be like Jeanette Oke as possible. And then I looked on the back of Jeanette Oke's book, and I saw this little emblem, and it was for Bethany House Publishers. And I thought, well, they'll want my book. So I figured out how at 15 to send in a book proposal. And that was its own journey. I'll spare you the drama. But this was also prior to email, so I do age myself a little bit. This was when you did a self-addressed stamped envelope if you wanted to get your proposal and your manuscript back. And you actually queried the editor themselves, and agents weren't even a thing. So I sent off my query at 15, and I sat back to wait. And I wasn't cocky enough to think that Bethany House was going to want it, but I was hopeful enough to think that they might. And so I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And then this little old lady from church, the one who had given me the Jeanette Oke book, came up to me, and she said, just so you know, and she used to be a school teacher. She's, just so you know, Jamie, there's a good possibility you might never hear back from the publisher. And that was like this crushing weight that came down. I'm like, what? That's rude. Anybody writes you, you write them back, right? And she goes, well, that's not necessarily how the publishing world works. And she says, I haven't actually been in it, but I've been to vendor conferences where I've met with different publishers, and they get a lot of these queries, and you're pretty young, so you may not get anything back. So imagine my excitement when, I don't even know how long it was, maybe a month later, there's a little envelope in the mail, and it was not my self-addressed stamped one, might I add, but it was from Bethany House Publishers, and it had their logo up in the top left-hand corner. And I opened it up, and there was a letter inside that I had no idea until fast forward probably 20 years later how valuable that letter was. One, because very rarely at that point in time were editors actually taking the time to personally respond to individual queries. There was usually a form letter that would be sent out that would state, thank you for your submission. At this point in time, we don't see a place for your novel within our lineup, etc., etc. But this was a personal letter. It had been typewritten and then it had been hand signed by an editor. And she said, you know, I saw your query come through and I picked it up because I noticed how young you were, and I noticed you were 15. And she said, I just want to let you know that right now it's not where it needs to be for us to consider for publication. But you have a good story. So keep practicing and keep writing, and maybe someday we'll see you again. Can I tell you the ministry of story in the response from the editor? It was the ministry of encouragement, right? I was an awful writer. It was an awful book. I mean, and she in a very polite way said that, but at the same time, she didn't do it in a way that crushed. She said, maybe, which was a hopeful, not a promise, but it was something that said, keep trying. And there's something important to what you're doing, Jamie, at 15. And what you're doing can be important someday. So keep trying. And that was such a lesson to me in the journey of writing, that it's not now, it's maybe. It's as God leads, as doors open or close, and it's the journey. The ministry of story is the ministry of journey, and it's being willing to go on this journey wherever God takes you, for however long God takes you, and maybe not with the end result that you wish. It could be completely different. I wrote another book, sent that in. That time I did get a form letter back. That was a no. And then I ended up meeting my husband and doing the whole dating thing. You know, all of a sudden you're early 20s and you're like, ooh, life happens. And I didn't write anymore. I just read, and I read voraciously. And fast forward to about 2008, I think it was, I picked up a Colleen Coble book from the library. I'd never heard of her. And I read it when my husband and I were in Montana, and my husband got so irritated because he had taken me to the most beautiful places in Montana, and my nose was in this book. I'm like, I could care less about the mountains. Oh, there's an elk. Yay, there's an elk. I want to read this book. He's like, you are missing everything because you're reading. Like, no, I have everything I need right here. So he went fly fishing in Montana on the rivers and the streams, and I sat in fly fishing waders, mind you. I donned the gear and sat in the water with the book, and I read the book. So I didn't fish. I just read the book in the water while he fly fished, and got through Colleen Coble's book. And at this point, the internet had been invented and email had been invented. So we fast forwarded quite a bit from when I was a child. And when I got home, I thought, you know, I've never in my life ever written a fan letter to anybody anywhere, but I'm going to send a letter to Colleen Coble because this book was like the best thing since strawberry jam on peanut butter. And so I sent her an email and I just said, thank you so much for your book, yada, yada, yada. And I sent the email, and the next day, Colleen Coble's name pops up in my inbox, and I just about fell out of my chair. I was like, wait, she's real? She's a real person? She actually lives and breathes? So I opened the email, and it was just a really nice email. It was a, hey, thank you so much for the encouragement, blah, 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 and just a casual email. Somehow, and to this day, I cannot tell you how, nor can I remember, she and I continued to communicate and develop a friendship over email. And it was slow because I didn't want to be like the stalker reader that authors are like, oh, block, block, block. She's creepy. So, it was slow. It was over time, but we became friends over the course of that year. And I got to know at the time, she was really close with Diane Hunt and Denise Hunter and Kristen Billerbeck. And they had kind of this core group of ladies that were writers. And I had sent Colleen an idea like, oh, this would be cool if you could ever write something with this suspenseful of an idea. I think it would be neat. And she emailed back and she goes, well, that's a great idea. She says, do you write? And I was like, oh, I haven't written for years. And she's like, well, I think you should write it. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm not writing it. And she goes, no, I think you should. She says, and she goes, I think you should consider coming to the ACFW Writers Conference. And so she started talking to me about that. And all of a sudden, that little itch began again that, maybe I could write a story. Maybe I could actually get published someday. And so I started thinking about all those different elements and aspects. And in the process, it was right at the time, my husband and I, we'd been married at that point for about 10 years. And we had been back and forth. Are we going to have kids? Do we want kids? We were of that first era of newlyweds that were like, we're never having children. We're just going to live it up and not have kids and not have a family. And then suddenly I start looking at my 30s coming at me and I'm going, who's going to take care of me when I'm old? And I thought maybe I should have a kid. So I said that to my husband. He's like, okay, we can have a kid. It wasn't that simple, trust me. And so I had a miscarriage. And then I had another miscarriage. And then I had a third miscarriage. And all during those times, I decided for therapy and something to do that I would just start writing, because what else do you do with your mind and your brain's just going places it doesn't want to go anymore. There was a lot of grief in that year and a half time period. And I had shared a little bit of it with Colleen. And Colleen had, for some reason or another, I don't remember why, given me her cell phone number and said, if you ever need anything, just call me and I'll pray for you over the phone. What a ministry of story. All right. Think about the ministry an author can have to a reader by just offering prayer. The opportunity doesn't come through the story. It comes through the community and it comes through the relationships. And I think sometimes as writers, we long to have a big name, and our name is so much bigger than the title because people just know our name more than they care about the title. Or we want to have thousands and thousands of books sold so we can make that our writing career and quit our day job. And there's all these things that are potentially legitimately good dreams. But in the process of being a Christian author, we can sometimes get sidetracked and forget the ministry of story that is buried in the words and in the pages of the books. And that's not always the story itself, but it's your story as the writer. And as the reader, on the flip side, I found out later, Colleen was giving me her number and was giving me her email because in response to her, I was responding with encouragement for her. And it was becoming a reciprocative, if that's a word, we're going to make it one, relationship of encouragement because of the bond that came because of our faith and the ministry of story. So sometimes readers feel like, what can I offer an author? Prayer. What can I offer an author? Encouragement. You know, those one lines in an email that said, thanks for your book. It made my night. It was the best night ever. You don't know how long an author will ride on an email like that. It can change their entire outlook of their story. And as a writer, remembering your readers, that sometimes your story doesn't have to even be published to be a ministry, right? You don't necessarily have to have a best-selling novel. You don't even have to have a novel. You could be in the process of creating your platform, which we all hear about as writers. But because of that platform you created and the two people that follow you, that one person of the two needs you and needs to hear your faith story. I ended up getting pregnant a fourth time, and I told my husband, if this one doesn't take, I'm not trying to be cruel, but I'm done. It's not going any further. We already weren't sure we were going to have kids. Why are we going through this misery of grief after grief after grief? There was an evening, I'm not even sure when it was, honestly, but my husband was a youth pastor and he was at our church at a church meeting. And I began to have signs of a fourth miscarriage. I didn't want to call my mom because she had a lot of anxiety, and I knew it would be a major trigger for that. So I'm sitting in my house alone, and I don't know what made me do this except for the Lord. I picked up my phone, and the first name that came up on my screen was Colleen Coble. I'd never called her before in my life. She'd given me her number. I'd had it for I don't know how long, and I was not going to be that reader that abused such a privilege. So I'd never used it. I dialed that number so fast, and to this day, I have no idea why I called Colleen Coble. It sounds like the most ridiculous thing an author could or a reader could do. I called her and she answered the phone immediately, and she said, "Honey, what's wrong?" And I said, "I think I'm having another miscarriage." She goes, "And you're walking around. I can tell you're walking by the sound of your voice." She says, "Go lay down." And she starts giving me all the things. "Go lay down, get on the couch. Where's your husband?" I said, "He's at church." She said, "Did you call him?" I said, "No." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Well, he's in a meeting." And she goes, "This is something you can interrupt a meeting for, honey." She says, "So here's what I want you to do." She says, "Are you willing to listen?" And I said, "Yes." Because at this point, that's why I called someone. She gave me instructions. She says, "You're going to get off the phone. You're going to call your husband. Let him take care of you. You're going to text me an update. And while all that's happening, I'm going to call Diane Hunt, Denise Hunter, and Kristen Billerbeck. And we're going to start praying," because she said, "This baby's going to live." And I was, okay, glad you know that, because I'm sure this baby's not. My husband came home immediately. We're on the road. My doctor was about 20 minutes away. So we're on their trip down, and my husband texts our doctor because he had given us his cell phone number for just this reason. And the doctor called, asked Nate a bunch of questions. And what I found out later, which Nathan did not tell me in the car, was that my doctor said, "Be prepared. This is miscarriage number 4. I mean, it matches everything. There's just no question. But we'll get you into the ER." He said, "I'll call ahead. I'll tell the tech to do an ultrasound." She's only 7 weeks along, so we don't even know if there's going to be anything there to see. But at this point, at best, if it was still a viable pregnancy, there would definitely be a heartbeat. So we're going to look for a heartbeat. If there's not one, we know it's number 4. Okay. Fast forward, we get down to the ER. At this point, I've already determined it's a miscarriage because there's just way too many signs that it's not a miscarriage. And my husband's pretty much figured that. So we're prepared. And the tech comes in and he does the ultrasound, and he's sitting there doing the whole thingy thing with the screen and all that fun stuff. And he goes, "Okay, okay." He goes, "Oh, well, yeah, yep, all right." And my husband goes, "What do you mean? Oh, yep, oh, all right." And he goes, "Well," he goes, "Right there." He goes, "Right there on the screen." He says, "I see that." He says, "That's the heartbeat." And it was boop, boom, boop, boom, boop, boom, boop, boom, boop. And that's all you could see at this point. I mean, it's that 7-week-old fetus that is not a fetus. That has life in it going boom, 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 boom. And I just kind of like stared, and my husband stared, and the tech looks, and he goes, "Oh, that's right. You're the couple they thought was having a miscarriage." And Nate goes, "And we're not." And he goes, "Oh," he goes, "I don't know what's happening," he said, "but the baby is a fighter. That heartbeat's totally normal." He said, "This baby's going to live." And we went home, and I'm texting Colleen. I'm like, there's a heartbeat. And this is midnight, by the way. By now it's like midnight or 1:00 in the morning. And I'm texting Colleen Coble, who I've never met, who's a best-selling author who gave me her cell phone number. And I said, "There's a heartbeat." And she goes, "Oh, praise Jesus." She says, "I'm going to go call Diane, and I'm going to call Denise. I'm going to call." So all this stuff is going on behind the scenes in the writers community of all these writers whose books were on my bookshelf as a reader. And now they're praying for the existence of my child. It's the ministry of story. 6 months later, I was at the ACFW conference for the first time, and I have a picture of me, big and round, with my child that was very much a fighter. And I have a picture of all 4 of the authors and their hands on my stomach and the big smiles. And they all claim my daughter, who's now going to be 14 in December, as theirs. Chloe is their miracle baby. And Diane Hunt, who's actually with Jesus now, prayed and would text me throughout the pregnancy and email. And we're praying for this little one. And they were so excited when she was born. And there was just all this joy. And never once did we discuss fiction, but we were bound together because of it. Because God was using something as a road and as a journey to bring people on a bigger journey that was a real story that he wanted to bond us with. I do have 2 children now. I have 3 with the Lord, and I have 2 children with me. And I thank the Lord for them every day. When my daughter was born, she immediately went into the NICU. She was born early. There were some issues, but she made it through that. But it was one last thing that I'll say about my daughter's birth was the night that they took her from me to take her to the NICU. I had held her for maybe 3 minutes, and she wasn't breathing well because her lungs were underdeveloped, was the gist of it. But at that point in time, you're never sure what's going on. Our doctor came in and he sat on the bed, and they had already taken her away, and they took her away with me doing the whole clawing at the IV scene because I had been adopted as a baby. And the only thing that had ever gone through my mind, which is probably extremely unfair to my birth mother, but as an adopted child had been something in my brain for years and years, was if the mother, who's the mama bear, won't fight for her baby, then who else will? There's not enough capital for anyone to stay if the mother doesn't. So when they're wheeling your child, your firstborn that barely made it into this world, away from you, it was every instinct in me to claw out the IVs. My own adopted mother, my mom, is holding me. She says, "It's okay, baby. It's okay, baby. She's going to be fine. It's okay." The doctor came in, sat down on my bed, and I don't believe to this day that he's a believer. But it was December 29th. It was shortly after Christmas. He sat down and he put his hand on my leg and he goes, "You know what you do with a night like tonight?" He said, "You be like Mary, the mother of Christ, the Christ child. You ponder all these things in your heart to know what the story is going to be." It was the strangest thing for a doctor to tell his patient, especially one that wasn't religiously inclined. But I think because it was Christmas, it was on his mind. And he just said, "Be like Mary, just ponder this in your heart." And I had such peace in that moment that God had been in Chloe's story from the moment she had been conceived, from the moment we thought she was going to die, to this moment, to the next moment, to the next moment. And that ministry of story became so important and so critical that when we left the hospital, I said to my husband, I said, "I need to write. I have to write stories." And I started to write voraciously. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And I studied and I tried things and I got rejected. And I tried to raise a baby and I worked full time. So my mom took care of my daughter most of the time during the day because both my husband and I were working full time to make ends meet. It was not I want to be a career person. It was like, we need to make a living and pay the mortgage. So this is what we have to do. And then I became pregnant with my son, who his pregnancy was thankfully, for the most part, normal. A few scares, but for the most part was normal. And I was home one day and I was laying in bed and I looked down at my Twitter, which I'm not on a whole lot. And I had just read a blog somewhere that said, when you do your bio on your Twitter, make sure you write down what genre you're writing. And so I changed my genre to historical suspense fiction. And it wasn't even really a genre, but that's just what I thought I wrote. And I looked down at my Twitter and I have a private message from a woman named Rayla Shanehair. And she claimed to work with Bethany House Publishers and she was interested in my story from a tweet that I had made about history and the fact that I had this in my bio. She said, "I'm interested in historical suspense. I would be interested in seeing some of your work." So what do? "Hi, Colleen. Have you ever heard of a woman named Rayla Shanehair, or is this a scam and I shouldn't send her my writing?" And I sent it off to Colleen and she's like, "I've never heard of her." She says, "Let me do some looking around for you." And Colleen looked around. She goes, "Oh, what do you know? She's a new acquisitions editor at Bethany House and she's very legit. So send her some stuff." So I sent her some stuff, and for the course of the next 3 years, Rayla and I would meet every year at the ACFW conference. And every year I would pitch a new book to her. And every year she'd say, that sounds like an interesting story. And every year it would come back with a note, "Oh, that's not going to fit our lineup." And the story just continues, right? You keep writing until I wrote the story. This is the story. And I knew this was going to be the one. It was a lighthouse. It was Lake Superior. It was everything I ever loved in the story. I went to ACFW, and I pitched it to an agent who loved it. And she's like, send me it. I want to look at it. I'm like, I'm in. I've got my agent. I just know it. I went and I sat down with Rayla, and I see her face, just this expression coming across her face. I'm like, I'm going to get signed. And she goes, oh my gosh, that story sounds so amazing. The only problem is we just signed somebody for a lighthouse story on Lake Superior with a female lighthouse who adopts a baby, all the same stuff. Like, you might as well have thought this other author and I sat down, collaborated, and saw who could write the book the fastest. It was that similar. And I'm like, you're kidding. It took me 11 months to write this thing, and it's worthless. Because what I found out too is, if in the Christian market, if one book comes out with this publisher, no of the other publishers are probably going to take anything that similar, because the market's so small. So I'm like, oh, I'm not going to have anything. This is great. Got home, got an email from one of the agents that I'd pitched to with this story, and his response was, God love him, dear Jamie, you have strong writing skills, but this is possibly the worst hero that I have ever read in my entire life. I cannot stand this hero. This is not how a man would respond to anything. So maybe one day, but not this time. And I'm like, oh, gee, thanks. That was special. Cry. And so the next week, my husband's a bow hunter. He was trying to get me into bow hunting. So I'm sitting up in a deer stand in the middle of November with a bow and arrow that I've been practicing. And yes, I can shoot it. And it's cold and I'm bored and I'm on my phone, and I see another email pop in from an agent. And I'm like, okay, here we go. And she emails, and it opens up. Dear Jamie, you have written possibly the most swoon-worthy, wonderful hero that I have ever read in my entire life. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, what? She's like, I think everything about him is wonderful, and the story is great, and I want to talk to you about offering you representation. And that was my first agent. And so I shared with her my interactions with Rayla, and we started on this journey. I started my first published work was, believe it or not, a historical Western romance with Barbara Publishing in one of their novella collections. And I started writing it, and I was like, this is so not me, but I'm going to write this story because it's an opportunity. And I had fun writing it. And I wrote a couple more novellas for Barbara. And then there was a whole sudden shift in the Christian market. And I won't even go into what caused it and how it went. But all of a sudden, a lot of authors were wondering if they were even going to have careers. And I'm sitting there going, well, I probably won't get much of anything with being just a novella writer. And Colleen Coble emails me out of the blue. And we've been emailing back and forth, but a little bit less. She emails me, she goes, I have a thought. What would happen if you wrote a story that was split time? Let me know what you think. I emailed her back, dear Colleen, I have no idea what split time even means. Please explain. So she emails back. She goes, that means like half the story takes place in the present day, half takes in the past. She said, have you ever read like Susan Meisner's Shape of Mercy, which I had. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm like, well, that's cool. And I said, well, I've always had this picture in my head about, the concept of like, if walls could talk. Like you go into an antique store, and I always had a love-hate relationships with antiques because they were interesting, but they couldn't tell me their story. So that way they were boring, right? Like I wanted to know who had lifted up this plate and what this plate had seen, or what this vase had seen, or this clock had seen, but they were inanimate objects that couldn't speak. So therefore I couldn't know their story. So therefore it was extremely disappointing. So I got to thinking, what would happen if I could tell the story of places and link the people together? And that's when I wrote The House on Foster Hill, which ended up being my first book with Bethany House Publishers. So think about that. 13 years old, I pitched to Bethany House Publishers on my journey of story. And I was 40, I think I was 43. It was probably about 30 years later that Bethany House actually signed for the house on Foster Hill. And as a side note, they rejected it the first time. So it had to go through a complete rewrite before they would even consider it the second time. So even that was a journey in and of itself. The story, the ministry of story, is one of relationships as much as it is a story. And it's the story of the people that come and go into your life. And it's the story of not imaginary characters. It's the story of real ones. I've written 13 books now with Bethany House. 2 of them are not out yet. So if you're wondering, I don't have that many on the shelf, that's because they're not out yet. But one of them that I wrote is called The Souls of Lost Lake. And I'll leave you guys with this brief story and then we can open up for questions. The Souls of Lost Lake, I decided to write, I think I started writing it in I wrote it during the pandemic. That was my pandemic story. It was 2020. I wrote The Souls of Lost Lake. It was the gory story of a young woman who was emerged from the woods dragging a bloodied axe, and they found her family murdered. And well, actually didn't find her family was gone, but it looked like they'd all been axe murdered, and everybody in the town thought Ava Coons was the axe murderer. And fast forward, to present day, Ava Coons still haunts the woods, and she's the campfire story that everybody gets scared of when they go to camp. That was the story. When I was writing it, I'm kind of like, okay, I needed to throw in a human element to the story. I need to throw in something that's going to make sense and be a ministry of story. And I will admit I was flippant about it. I'm not always that way, but with this one, I really was. And I decided I'm just going to put in somebody who dies of cancer because that's something people relate to. I'll have to do some research on it. I think I'll make it breast cancer. That's really relatable. So I created the story of the main character's best friend, who was also the love interest. His mother was her mentor, and his mother was dying of stage 4 breast cancer. So I got the book written, wrote it, sent it off to my publisher. I got the edits back, and usually when I get the edits back for that first round, they give me about 4 weeks to get the edits done. And there's lots of notes, lots of pages of let's change this, or how's about this, etc. And they sent them back to me at the exact same time that my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer. She had had absolutely no symptoms that were anything outside of the ordinary. And they sent her home and said, you have maybe 3 months to live. And 3 days later, I was sitting next to her. She was in bed. They were getting ready to bring hospice and stuff in. And I said, Mom, you go ahead and take your nap. I'm going to sit here and edit. I opened my books to edit, and the scene that I was editing was the scene where the mother in the book passes away. And I looked up as I'm editing, and I looked at my mom, and I just knew it's actually happening right now. And so the moment went from story into real life. And I went from that moment of editing a fictional passing to experiencing a real one. My mom had told me when it was her time that she said, please hold my hand until I see Jesus. But when I do, I'm going to let go. She said, get me to the finish line. And I said, Mom, I'm running that race with you to the very, very end. And I held her hand. My dad held her other hand. And we actually got to a point where she got this expression on her face. Like she always used to get in emotional movies, like a really emotional moment, like just like awe and emotion of like, wow. And she took our hands and she went and she pushed our hands away and she was gone. And after that, I had 1 week left to get edits done. And my editor was like, if you need more time, take it. And I said, no. I said, my mom didn't die in vain. Her death was a gift from God, because so many people have these experiences of, even within the Christian community, of death stories that are traumatic and they're difficult to go through. Death is a difficult, difficult thing. And the passing of somebody into the peace of Christ's arms is not always peaceful. But my mom's was so remarkably poignant, of someone who literally ran to the finish line, let go, and crossed it, that I was like, this has got to be in the story. And I rewrote the section where the mother passed away, and she said goodbye to her baby boy, and she said goodbye to her family, but she said hello to eternity. And I was like, this is where, when we're writing story or we're reading story, the truth of who God is can be so poignant, even if it's not blatantly written as an evangelical message, right? And as believers, death, whether it's a miscarriage or whether it's the death of my mom, is not final when God is a part of that picture and that faith journey and and that story that we're on. And to me, writing a book, so here's the other part of that answer. Why do you write the dark stories? Because I want people to see light at the end. There's so much darkness in this world, and parts of us are really intrigued by it. And I admit, I like some of the dark stuff because it's really intriguing, but I always love being able to come out of it. And I love being able to see that hope and know that, like I told my son the other day, he still cries for Nanny. He wishes Nanny so much. He was her little boy. And I said to him, I said, buddy, you've said your last goodbye to Nanny, but you have not said your last hello. And that's coming. And that's the hope. And that's the story. That's the ministry of story. So wherever you are, whether you're a reader or whether you're a writer, there is a ministry of story for you. What is it? I don't know, because only God can reveal that to you. What is your journey? I don't know. Will you ever be published? You may not. Will you ever sell books? You might be a best-selling author. You might get a fan email from me. Like, what? It's that. I'm so excited, right? It's just, but we're a community of believers bound together by story, and God uses story to share his truth. And to me, that's the ministry of story. And that's what I wanted to share with you all tonight. So I'll stop now so that we have time for questions.
That's amazing, Jamie. We've got a lot of people commenting in the chat about how amazing a story that is, and really appreciate it. And we really thank you for sharing your heart, because that's not always an easy thing to do either. And
no.
As writers, we're often bleeding on the page, as they say. So thank you for that. We do have a few questions, but I just wanted to say on a personal note that the first time I met Jamie was at ACFW. And if you don't know what ACFW is, American Christian Fiction Writers, it's a conference for writers. And we met, and she had this little notebook. I believe your mother gave it to you, if I'm remembering it right. Someone gave you this
notebook.
Yes,
someone had, yeah.
To give to...
It was my mother-in-law.
Your mother-in-law. To give to other authors to sign, to get encouragement from them, and to realize that you're on the path and that you're going to be published one day. And 13 books. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It seems like overnight to me, but it wasn't, of course, but let me get to a couple questions here. How do you get in the mindset to write the scarier sort of subject lines, like murder or like that?
Well, that's the deviant side of me that we didn't talk about tonight. I've always loved mystery. I've always loved suspense. I also, if I hadn't been a writer and I hadn't ended up getting married and becoming a mother, I probably would have gone into criminal psychology, because I find it extremely fascinating. And so I'll study that on the side, and I like to build that into my stories. I also have always been intrigued by, honestly, life after death, right? And not in the sense of summoning anything, so don't go there. I've never been to a seance in my life. I don't do tarot cards or anything, so I'm not going there. But I've been fascinated with the concept that there is a spiritual realm and there is the Lord, right? And he created everything. He's all powerful. And he gave us really strict instructions not to dabble in things that are not of him. And so I've always wondered, how do we look at those types of stories then, when I know people, even in my church, who say that they grew up in haunted houses? I'm like, okay, so they had some sort of an experience. I can't explain it. I don't know what it was, but they believe it. So how do you go there? And then I always enjoyed watching Scooby-Doo and, silly stories like that. I never really watched a horror movie in my life. I watched Friday the 13th for the first time last year. So that was my induction. And that was funny because it was a 1980s movie. And so it was actually kind of funny because it wasn't realistic. But how do I go there in my mind? I go there in my mind usually after I've figured out the theme. Like, what is it that I want to leave a reader with as far as hope? And there'll be one word usually, whether it's grace or whether it's mercy or whether it's refuge. And then I kind of work backwards from there, because to really understand a word in light of eternity and in light of the spiritual world and in light of who God is, you have to go to the darkest place where that word first was needed, right? And so I'll go back to that darkness and then I'll work back toward the light.
Okay, cool. This is a question from a writer, from Victor. Victor's, he self-publishes, he says, because he's 78, and
Awesome.
wonders if any publishers have entertained a quite senior author.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. I know several authors personally who are seniors, and publishers have just signed them or are have already published them. So you're never too old to write a good story, ever. And whether you're self-publishing it or you're going with a small press or you're going with somebody like a Bethany House publisher or whatever, your story is your story, right? And if God's put it on your heart, there's a place for it. So go for it. And if you get a no, don't take that as a discouragement or like you're unwanted and your story is unworthy and unneeded. It just means God's going to use it in a different place. And that might be one person at your church that you somehow feel led to say, hey, I wrote a story. Do you want to read it? And that story might be for that one person, right? Or you might send it off to a big publisher and the big publisher might say, yeah, I want this story. I don't care that you're 78 years old. And they publish it. And now thousands of people are reading your story. It's, what does God want to do with your story? Where is he taking your story? And what ministry can he use with your story? So sky's the limit because God has none.
Very true. We have lots of comments. Michael says God uses, he's quoting, God uses story to share his truth. Jesus used parables. So that's definitely true. A lot of people are thanking you for your talk tonight. Nancy says she loves the phrase, the ministry of story. And she also echoes what Michael said. Jesus himself told stories to get his point shared.
I will say the phrase, the ministry of story, is not mine. Actually, that came from a conversation I had with the author, Nicole Deese. If any of you have ever read any of her books, she writes really good, kind of dramatic women's fiction, I guess you might call it. But she and I were having a conversation about story once, and she said, it really is a ministry of story. And that just stuck with me. So I've used the phrase a lot, but I certainly won't claim ownership to that one. And I'll mention to check out Nicole Deese's books, because if you love the ministry of story, there are so many authors out there who firmly believe that and are working to put that out there.
And we still have a few more minutes for questions. So if you all have any questions, put them in the chat. But Jamie, I think it's interesting that your first published story was a different genre.
I know, right?
You wrote the story that somebody wanted, and then you were able to eventually get yourself back to where you felt like you needed to be.
Right.
So,
well, and I think too, I mean, the road to publication, I'm sharing a lot of the faith side of the road to publication tonight. There's also a real business side to publication. And there, it does need to be some realism when you go into it, that you are entering a business world as well. And it's an interesting dichotomy in the Christian community. And I've even talked with my publisher about this, in that they want to be a ministry at the same time they have to run a business. And it's a really difficult balance at times for publishers and agents and writers, because you can't just be a minister and expect to get published because God's called you to do it. Because there's also the business side of it. And so some big publishers aren't going to take a risk on you because it's just not selling. And so then you're like, well, did God actually call me to do this? And so I dare to say, yes, he did. But sometimes he redefines the ministry that that we think we're supposed to do. My husband asked me once, he goes, why do you want to get published? Why is that so important? Because you don't have to be published to write a book. You can still write a book as a hobby. And I could never answer the question, because I didn't want to be published because I wanted to be famous or something like that. It wasn't anything like that. And it really wasn't even, I wanted to be published because I wanted to make a lot of money, because that doesn't happen. But I couldn't give him a sufficient answer until I just realized I wanted to be published because God wouldn't let me not want to. Right? And there's a verse that says, God will give you the desires of your heart. When I was little, I thought that meant he was a genie of the lamp. Like, dear Lord, I want a stuffed lion. And he would just, poof, there's your stuffed lion. That wasn't quite what it meant. And when I started studying what it means for God to give you the desires of your heart, that God will, it's because God plants them. As you're submitted to his will, he plants in your heart the desire to do where he wants you, what he wants you to do, and to go where he wants you to go, right? As you're submissive to him. And so I found, even as I was going through my journey, that I was getting more and more doubtful I'd actually get published by a bigger publisher. And I got to the point where I was, that's okay. I'm okay. It's okay. And I really honestly would have been okay, because God was putting in me a desire to go where he wanted me to go. And if you can be in that position of complete surrender and just let him hold you in his grip, he can just take you where you need to go. And it sounds cliche, but you don't have to worry about anything then. You go into the business world of publishing, and if they turn you down, then it's extremely disappointing and disheartening and discouraging. And at the same time, it's reaffirming that, well, God hasn't given up on you yet, and he's got a plan.
Yes, I hope everybody heard that, because that's an important message. I think we sometimes get caught up in what we think we need to do to succeed. But once you surrender to that, it's so much better to have that peace.
It is.
And not that constant.
And God can do so much more because you're not resisting.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? We have more comments. Michael says books can outlive their authors. Remember that My Utmost for His Highest was published after Oswald Chambers had died. So we don't always see the fruits of our labor. That doesn't mean we shouldn't keep at it. So
right. Thank you all so much for having me here tonight. It's been a blessing, and I just really appreciate all of you readers who are there, and you writers. It's just a great community to be a part of.